Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, today's chapters are 2 Samuel 3 and 4. And what we see is the household of David and the household of Saul at war. Remember, David's just ruling Judah. This illegitimate king, Ishbosheth, who's been set in office by Abner, the great general of those territories, is on the one side. And then you've got David, who has his general, Joab. So you see these two households at war with these two generals backing these two kings. That's how the chapter begins. We're told that David was busy leading Judah at the time. So he was getting on with what God had called him to do. But his private life seems to be in a little bit of disarray. His first wife, Michal, is not even living with him. She's on the other side because she's married to another guy. And he goes through a series of women and produces a series, I think it's 6 women, 6 kids during this particular period. Now, I ask myself when I'm reading this, how can I learn from this? What does it illustrate for me? Well, clearly David and his household is representing the church. That's Judah represents the church. But this other household, what is it? Well, it's frustrating the purposes of the church. It's curtailing the growth of the church. It's legitimate in a sense that it's legally binding. It's got laws and officials in it. And when I look at it, I think, the church right now is an unprecedented time in history. You've got governmental laws. You've got different lobbies, role players, all inhibiting what we would think that church's growth and the church's movement. Now, it's very tempting to go to war with the house of Ishbosheth, as it were. But David doesn't. He waits. And this is what happens. The house of Ishbosheth turns on itself, the house of Saul. And this is how it happens. The king he's a bit of an insecure guy, and he says, hey, to his general Abner, I see that you have been sleeping with my father's concubine. Abner gets furious. And in fact, he says, do you think I'm disloyal? In fact, now you're going to see disloyalty. And what he does is he goes and he rounds up all the elders of those tribes and says, listen, I think we should put a mutiny on the table and we should go over to David. Well, at this point, Ishbosheth just keeps very, very quiet. What's David doing? He's getting on leading what God called him to lead. Granted, his private world wasn't in great shape, but he was getting on doing what God had called him to do. Abner goes to David and says, listen, I've got this proposal for you. David says, don't you come without bringing my wife, my first wife. So it happens. They have this meeting. David gives him a party and sends him away. But enter the fray now David's general, Joab. He arrives back from a raiding band. He finds out that his arch enemy, Abner, of this other, kingdom, has been there. He's furious. And so what he does is he goes and he finds him at a place called Sirah, the cistern of Sirah. Now, this is the closest place I've got to a cistern on my property. It's this borehole water tank. And he finds him there and he says, now come with me. And he takes him to Hebron. And it says that he moves him into an inner chamber. And so he comes into this inner chamber to tell him, listen, I've got a secret. You wanting to do a political game with my captain. Let me talk to you. And in this inner chamber, he stabs him and he kills him. That's how this chapter draws to a close. When David hears about it, this is not great on a number of levels. Firstly, he's trying to arrange a peace deal, and this guy's killed. So he says, listen, you're going to mourn the guy you've killed. It's one general killing another. You could say it's an act of war, but David didn't see it that way. And so all the people see David mourning. And that's how that chapter ends. The next chapter, chapter 3, opens with a look at this counterfeit household, this household that's curtailing the growth of the kingdom of God. And Ishbosheth is left there. He's a scared man, it says, because, he's lost his general. But there's also another descendant of Saul in the household, Mephibosheth, who's crippled in both feet. So it's a rather pathetic looking household. And then these two raiding band leaders, Baana and Rechab. Baanah and Rechab go and they find Ishbosheth. This is the king of the other states. They find him lying on his bed at noontime, and they go into his house and they cut off his head. They grab his head and they take it off to David and say, listen, we've established your kingdom for you. Here's your opponent's head. Well, David takes one look at it and says, this is not right. And he puts those two to death. He says, that's murder. You can't do that. What do we get from this story? Well, firstly, I see that God clears the decks for us. You know, if many Christians today are really frustrated by what's going on, just allow God to clear the decks. Get on with what God's called you to do. And he will handle the obstructions. He will handle the rules and regulations and all the frustrating lobby groups that are standing in your way. David was very restrained. He was restrained. There are these two generals either side that are fighting, but David is restrained. I believe he's calling the church to be restrained this time. Unlike David, we need to pay attention to our private world, our private lives, our marriages, our homes, and mourn when it's appropriate. Back justice when it's appropriate, but trust the future into God's hands. He's got this. His church, his promises over it, and he's got plans for his church, and we do not need to fret. He's got this.